Well, welcome to our Bible study, More Than a Shepherd, about David. Today is actually the last session for this Bible study, for this very one. So we can always start up a new one, but not next week. Next week is Holy Week, so it's going to be a little crunchy there. But we're gonna have services here on Monday, Thursday, on Good Friday. We're gonna have an Easter Vigil here on Saturday, and the whole caboodle on Sunday morning, right, with the Easter breakfast and Easter egg hunt. So come on by Thursday through Saturday, 7 p.m. and Sunday morning. I think Easter breakfast starts at 8:30. So that's exciting enough. All right, today we're going to actually go not even into 2 Samuel. Today we're going to go into 1 Kings, just chapter 1. So usually, if we can say if 1 Samuel is mainly about King Saul, if you think about it, right? Because Saul was still the king, he was still ruling. I know David kind of pops up there midway through the book, but for the most of it, it was still kind of Saul talking or still ruling, basically. And in 2 Samuel, we see David kind of going all the way through, right? He was king throughout this entire time. Today, when you go into 1 King, all of a sudden there's a lot of time that has elapsed from last time. I know last week we spoke about Psalm 51, about the Psalm of guilt that David wrote kind of after he had cheated on all his wives, I guess, with Bathsheba, where he was still obviously a young enough man, I guess, to at least do what he did there, right? Today we're going to see a very different David, if we're really kind of going to it. Before we kind of go into it, I just wanted to talk about, or just wanted to ask you, what did you learn about David so far in this Bible study? What is it that kind of like perked your ear that you feel like you're going to take with you from this?
His dedication.
His dedication?
During those times, and then how can you apply it to today's times?
Oh, yeah.
To have that type of dedication based on, like we were talking before, the thing about everything happening yesterday in our lifestyle, but then how do we keep going? How can I be here, faced now at home? Things like that. As to we're not living in war either.
No.
We're not in Ukraine right now. So how can you apply all of his lessons during wars, fighting in wars? That's the only thing I can really come up with.
Yeah. And I mean, he's kind of experienced both, right? It was a skirmish here and there. I mean, that's basically it's at least like a battle, right? I mean, you might die. There's just no guaranteeing that you come back, right? And we've kind of seen how throughout all this time he kind of always had put God first, right? And we kind of seen how God has been with him throughout all this time, right? How he'd grown stronger and stronger from being that really the youngest, the shepherd boy who had not been the tall, oldest, handsome guy necessarily in the family, or I mean, it is said that he was handsome, but either way, his older brother was would have been prime candidate, right? He looked like king material right there, and he wasn't chosen, right? But we can see how the Lord was with him and how he was able to kind of defeat all the threats that him and his that kind of faced him and his people, right? And how he kind of walked through that, always asking God first, and how he grew stronger and stronger through that. How he carried the ark back to Jerusalem, or how he conquered Jerusalem first of all, and then carried the ark there ultimately. How he tried to even build a house for the ark, and how God was with him throughout all this time, right? And ultimately we kind of saw how, well, really honestly, once the whole Bathsheba thing happened, it kind of started to switch there. After that, it became quite troublesome for him, I guess, and God promised him it's going to be rough for you, and we kind of skipped the rough parts there. I felt like it would have been too long of a Bible study series. Maybe we can do that another time, but it certainly was something, right? All right. Well, shall we dig into 1 Kings? Can somebody just read it for me, if you don't mind?
The struggle for succession. King David was old and advanced in his years, and although they covered him with clothes, or cloths, depending on how you want, he could not get warm. So his servant said to him, "Let a young virgin be sought for my lord the king, and let her wait on the king, and be his attendant. let her lie in your bosom, so that my lord the king may be warned. So they searched for a beautiful girl throughout all the territory of Israel and found Abishag the Shunammite and brought her to the king. The girl was very beautiful. She became the king's attendant and served him, but the king did not know her sexually. Now Adonijah, son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. He prepared for himself chariots and horsemen, and 50 men to run before him. His father had never at any time displeased him by asking, Why have you done thus and so? He was also a very handsome man, and he was born next after Absalom. He conferred with Joab, son of Zeruiah, and with the priest Abiathar, and they supported Adonijah, but the priest Zadok and Benani, son of Jehoiada, and the prophet Nathan and Shemaiah and Ray, and David's own warriors, did not side with Adonijah. Adonijah sacrificed sheep, oxen, fatted cattle by the stone Zohelet, which is beside Enrogel. And he invited all his brothers, the king's sons, and all the royal officials of Judah. But he did not invite the prophet Nathan or Benaiah and the warriors or his brother Solomon.
All right, thank you. Let's kind of stop there.
You did real good with the names.
Yeah, and boy, there's a lot of names in there, right? Maybe we can just kind of start there, because I'm sure most of those kind of sound unfamiliar to us. I know we've seen a couple before, right? We've all known about Nathan by now, right? Nathan was the prophet who first of all gave David the prophecy that God was going to build him a dynasty, right, or a house that shall last forever, when David wanted to build him a temple. Nathan had also been that prophet who, the first time he kind of steps on the scene, he just starts it off with the false prophecy, right? He was the kind of guy like, sure, David, go ahead, build God a temple. And then God's like, no, Nathan, you're going to have to call you back on that one, right? I think another person that we have seen already, and I think he was in here, was Joab, son of Zeruiah. I'm not sure if you remember Joab anymore. Joab was kind of David's general throughout all this time. He was the guy who was fighting. Yes, Joab was. He was the commander of his army. Apart from that, if you remember, a few weeks ago when we had the whole battle, David's Judah versus Israel, and there was this guy Abner who killed like somebody, killed like this one young hot warrior who just kind of ran after him with like the butt end of his spear. That was the brother of Joab.
Yes. Okay.
So, and the guy who killed him was called Abner. So that's going to matter later on, though. But technically, those are probably the two names that we still know. Like Joab and Nathan are pretty much the ones that we had, I think, encountered so far. All these other ones are probably pretty new. But one thing they all have in common is they're all still from Hebron. David still remembers them from the days before he was the king over Israel and Judah. And he still knows them before he had conquered Jerusalem. So those are his old pals, basically, that are kind of coming together and go like, yeah, Adonijah is going to be the new king. This is awesome. This is great. And it kind of looks like, if you really look at it, right, Adonijah is the oldest still living son of David. He was actually David's fourth son. Absalom had started a rebellion and had kind of, and died as a result of that. And, sorry, what was the other name? The other sons were basically, then there was Amnon. I think he died as well in that rebellion. I think he raped one of the sisters. And then there was another son, Kileab, and we never really hear about Kileab. So he might have just died during childbirth. This is at least what's assumed, because there's not a single story that we really hear about that son. He must have been born and probably died again pretty soon, pretty early on. So it's, even though Adonijah was the fourth son, he's still the oldest who's still living. And we always kind of think of, right, the oldest is going to get the throne, etc. But, as we see with King David, that's not always necessarily the case, is it? So I hope that helped a little bit about talking about the names. But starting with the obvious, of course, a lot of time has passed, and David is now old, and obviously it's hard to keep warm, right? What do you do to a guy who has 1,000 wives and is not able to keep warm, right? You give him 1,001st, I guess. So he gets Abishag, and clearly, I mean, they must have been pretty much found Miss Israel back in those days, because Shunammite, I think the city of Shunem is just way up north. It's like way up northwest of Jerusalem, really. So they have walked a really long way even to just find that girl. So they really went at lengths, literally, to try to find a beautiful woman for her. And interestingly enough, the words of the servant of one of his servants here are very interesting too. Let a young virgin be sought for the Lord my king, and let her and let her lie in your bosom. We've actually heard those words before, and it was when Nathan's told the parable about the poor guy who had this one ewe lamb, his pet lamb.
Yes,
the pet lamb was lying in his bosom too. So interestingly enough, right, like Bathsheba once lay, I guess, at Uriah's bosom. So this young lady should lie at David's bosom now. And interestingly enough, right afterwards, Bathsheba kind of walks into the door as well, or at least we will see that not too far from now. So I think that was another interesting part about the story in and of itself.
Well, I thought they made such a huge point that she's beautiful. They searched all over.
Yeah.
Well, she was there for kind of a practical purpose. What difference did that make? I get that he's the king.
Yeah.
But what difference did that make? But it did.
Yeah. I mean,
that kind of jumped out at me because I thought, well, what difference?
Yeah, it almost
She's
seems
just
like
there
they're
keeping
focusing
warm.
on the wrong
Yes,
thing.
and they keep making a point
Yeah.
of how beautiful. They searched for the person
yeah,
beautiful.
yeah.
What difference did that make?
Yeah, but to go from a peasant to become a servant and royalty, I would have that lifestyle over.
Yeah, so good for her. But
Yeah.
I guess it is good for her. Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I guess her beauty is important in that it probably keeps even an old man warmer than and not as pretty woman, I guess. So I would say that's
If you think about it, though, otherwise you would just go out and get somebody. So then they would all be in contests, see, for it. So
Maybe.
So you make you have
Yeah.
some guidelines.
yeah.
Bring in an enemy and get stabbed quick.
Who knows? Yeah, man.
Because that happened a lot back then too in those days. I mean,
Bringing in what? I'm sorry.
thieves or you
Oh,
know,
yeah.
assassins and sneak into towns and kill certain people to cause disruption back in those days.
Probably, yes, and that would happen a long time from David's birth, even, right? Still centuries and millennia later. Yeah.
Well, to me, they're concentrating on the wrong attributes. Because if you're going away and if you're searching for beauty, you could end up with some femme fatale or whatever.
Okay.
An assassin, like what you're talking about.
Yeah,
Good.
that's true. That probably has existed back in those days as well.
But they said she was very young, didn't they?
They did say that. That's true.
Probably a teenager.
Yeah. Well, she could have been, the daughter of a femme fatale and have learned from youth. But yeah.
The translation that the Catholics translated into virgin, the word is most commonly translated into young woman.
That's right.
And I don't know if this is the particular translation. I'm not that familiar with
Yeah.
scriptures.
It might be the same word, honestly. I haven't checked in the Hebrew, but you're right. In Isaiah, right, in chapter 9, like what we always read for Christmas, right? A virgin shall give birth to a son, and you shall name him Prince of Priests, etc. That can also mean young woman, and it honestly in that prophecy probably means just young woman. So you're spot on there, Doug. And it probably is the same word here. I'm assuming. I'm not sure how many words there were for young woman / virgin.
But it could mean virgin also, but the young woman would be the primary definition.
Yeah.
But like virgin might be kind of implied.
Yeah, I
definition.
think so. For the most part,
Yeah, because
young
all
women.
weddings were arranged back then too. weren't they?
Exactly,
For the
exactly,
women under
exactly.
dowries and all
You
of
didn't
that.
just go out and date somebody once you turned,
Yeah, for the
I don't
women.
know, 14, 15, 16 years old or something like that. And honestly, by that time, sometimes they were probably already married off to somebody else. And, you know, if King David came by or his servants and said, hey, the king needs your services, then, well, I'm sorry, off you went, you know. Yeah, so that's definitely a thing. I'm not sure how much competition David actually had back in those days. It seems like he even still, I mean, obviously his son Absalom did a number, right? And others probably did as well. So I'm sure there was always a little bit of commotion. I'm not sure how much came from the outside and how stable his kingdom was at that point, you know. So, but you're right, it could have been an assassin as well. Either way, it leaves much to be thought of, right?
But
in
this could
terms of-
start some of the destabilization.
Yep. Yep.
When you have more than one wife, you're looking at destabilization, and I think that's some of the points in the Bible.
Yeah.
When you have more than one life, there's a lot of jealousies and assassinations and stuff
Yeah.
like that
Yeah.
go on.
That's true. Either way, right? This is the perfect soap opera setup, right?
Yeah.
We have two camps. We have old King David. Bam, right? So who's going to get it here, right? So is Nathan and Zadok's camp? Are they going to get it, or is it still going to be old Joab and Adonijah, who are going to get their person elected, right? But either way, right? What do you do when you want to get elected king, right? You throw a big party with an elite gathering, right? And that's exactly what Adonijah here apparently does, right? And really the whole offering part is probably what you did when you wanted to crown yourself king. You know, it was kind of part of the ritual, is to go through, sacrificing sheep and oxen and fatted cattle and so forth. And that happened in En Rogel, and that is just, it's south of Jerusalem. So it's probably like a walk, like a day's walk, probably less actually than that, just away. So they just kind of went right south of town to proclaim him king, more or less.
But to me, this is also kind of treading on a little bit dangerous ground.
Ah.
Because when you make sacrifices, you're supposed to be sacrificing to God.
Which they probably were, but yeah, please go on, yeah.
Because it could give the appearance or the feeling that David is the God, and it could be a distraction or whatever.
I think they sacrificed to the Lord. I guess it was just back then, almost like praying and worship. It was almost like a ceremony where you probably prayed to God for the king to live long and be prosperous, and everyone is getting wealthier and all of that. But yeah.
But this might be part of the setup to the fall, I think.
Good point, right? It's certainly, he's certainly quick to do all of those things, right?
Yeah.
I mean, all we hear is, hey, Adonijah got a few guys together, and all of a sudden here they are, pretty much crowning him king or getting ready to do so, right? Aren't there some steps in between, between I want to become king to I am the king? I mean, it just kind of it all happens a little bit quickly, right?
It's okay, Pastor. You can stay in bed. I got it now.
Exactly.
That's basically what happened,
Yeah, exactly. It's okay, Daddy.
I got it.
I got it, exactly. We're just going to sacrifice some sheep and some oxen.
Party and
exactly.
Get everybody on my side, and then when they realize the wool's been covered over their eyes,
Yep.
Now what do they do?
Exactly. And I guess one thing I also wanted to point out in this story is really you have, so Abiathar or Abiathar, right? He is one of David's high priests. Zadok is the other one. So he basically has two high priests who are running the show, right? The two, so basically you have two bishops, if you will, right? One is pro-Adonijah, the other one is pro-Solomon. So that's kind of a big deal here, I guess. Yeah, well then you have to, honestly, Zaniah, I think, is one who is pro-Solomon as well. He's kind of a commander of David's mercenaries, so apparently David has a mercenary army. And his regular army commander, Joab, he's pro-Adonijah as well. So it's interesting how the heads of military and of spirituality or of religion are here kind of represented in both camps and are almost like facing off with each other. Just an interesting thought, I think, to kind of have in mind as the story goes on. All right, can somebody read for us? This is going to be a chunk. Actually, we can probably... yeah, if it's too much, I can take over whenever you get tired. But can somebody read for us verses 11 through 27?
I will.
Cool.
Then Nathan said to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, "Have you not heard that Adonijah, son of Haggith, has become king, and our Lord David does not know it? Now therefore come, let me give you advice, so that you may save your own life and the life of your son Solomon. Go in at once to King David and say to him, Did you not, my lord the king, swear to your servant, saying, Your son Solomon shall succeed me as king, and he shall sit on my throne? Why then is Adonijah king? Then while you are still there speaking with the king, I will come in after you and confirm your words." So Bathsheba went to the king in his room. The king was very old. Abishag the Shunammite was attending the king. Bathsheba bowed and did obeisance to the king, and the king said, "What do you wish?" She said to him, "My lord, you swore to your servant by the Lord your God, saying, Your son Solomon shall succeed me as king, and he shall sit on my throne. But now suddenly Adonijah has become king, though you, my lord the king, do not know it. He has sacrificed oxen, fatted cattle, and sheep in abundance, and has invited all the children of the king, the priest Abiathar and Joab, the commander of the army. But your servant Solomon he has not invited. But you, my lord the king, the eyes of all Israel are on you to tell them who shall sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. Otherwise it will come to pass, when my lord the king sleeps with his ancestors, that my son Solomon and I will be counted offenders." While she was still speaking with the king, the prophet Nathan came in. The king was told, "Here's the prophet Nathan." When he came in before the king, he did obeisance to the king with his face to the ground. Nathan said, "My lord the king, have you said, Adonijah shall succeed me as king, and he shall sit on my throne? For today he has gone down and has sacrificed oxen, fatted cattle, and sheep in abundance, and has invited all the king's children, Joab the commander of the army, and the priest Abiathar, who are now eating and drinking before him, and saying, Long live King Adonijah. But he did not invite me, your servant, and the priest Zadok, and Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, and your servant Solomon. Has this thing been brought about by my lord the king, and you have not let your servants know who should sit on the throne of my lord the king after him?"
Thank you, Tammy. All right, that was a mouthful, wasn't it?
Yes.
Okay, are there any questions you have about these verses? Was there anything that perked up in your mind?
I like
Yeah.
when the king sleeps with his ancestors. I don't know why. That's a very nice way to say that, when the king sleeps with his ancestors.
Yep.
That's just a nice
That's exactly
way to
right.
say
Yep.
it, you
And
know?
really, honestly, to be truthful with you, back in ancient Israel, they sometimes had just tombs, just like little caves where they would actually, if you were dead, you would go in there and there would be the bones of your other ancestors. So it was kind of like a family affair.
Almost,
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, but it is a very euphemistic way to kind of say it, right? When the king sleeps with his ancestors. Yeah.
That's kind of nice.
So this is kind of a confusing part of the story, I think, or it starts out weird. At least my first question when I read that, I'm not sure about you, but it's like, why is Nathan so invested in having Solomon become king? I mean, why is it Nathan? Because he kind of drives the thing, doesn't he? He's the first one to come up. He's like, hey, Bathsheba, Adonijah's becoming king. That means Solomon is not going to be king. That means you're in danger. And then everyone acts, right? Or Bathsheba starts to act. And it's also Nathan who comes up with a plan right then and there, right? Oh, I got the idea. Why don't you go to the king and tell him that Adonijah just crowned himself king, right? And then I'll come in and tell him the same. So it's just going to be like, wow, just
What's going on?
yeah, exactly. Just as a subtle way to tell the king that we're alarmed. Yeah. So and why it is Nathan, honestly, we do not really find out. It's not like these verses tell us, but it seems like Nathan clearly had some sort of an interest here in having Solomon become king.
Or, I don't know, I think I just, without really thinking about
Yeah.
it at the time, thought, well, God led him to do that, because it had
Ah,
to happen.
that makes sense.
And God,
Yeah.
He was the,
Yeah.
the vehicle to
Could be.
accomplish this.
Yeah.
Because it had to happen, and somebody had to get it started, and so God led Nathan to
Yeah.
do it.
That's
I don't know, but maybe that's too simple.
maybe that's a good interpretation of it, right? The text doesn't tell us.
No.
The text doesn't say that it was so. The text doesn't say it wasn't so. But either way, right? It's certainly happening. On the other hand, right? I think Solomon, when he was born, right, they gave him the nickname Jedediah, right, like favored one of God. So interestingly enough, I mean, there was something there.
Do we know what happens to Nathan, further down the road? I mean, is he rewarded in some way? Does he become, something, I'm just thinking,
You know what, honestly,
is that what he's thinking?
yeah.
Ooh, I'll get, something in the long run when Solomon
could
finds
be.
out that I made this happen.
Like a selfish motivation
Yeah,
kind of
that
thing.
there's something
Could
there
be.
going on.
Could be. I don't think I'm not sure if we hear about him ever again. But certainly right here, he's certainly a driving force. And I mean, honestly, on the other hand, it would be a good way to get yourself up the prophet ladder, I guess, right in the Old Kingdom. So, good point there. So we have Nathan's action, and at least we can kind of also hear, Bathsheba really, and at least this time she's not being treated like a piece of furniture as she was a couple of weeks ago, right, where it was all kind of David's actions and David's things, right, and how she acts is kind of interesting too if we think about it, right. I mean, we can actually see her just not only being on board, but she really runs with this plan here as well. The other part is, I think, was also really interesting is when we look at Nathan's plan here in this story. They both remind David that he has sworn that Solomon would become king. That never happened. It's not like David actually ever said, "Oh, I solemnly swear, Solomon, you shall be my successor." It never happened. So it was just still left kind of wide open. But they both kind of insist on it. And what Nathan initially suggested to Bathsheba was, right, like, why don't you go in and ask him, "Hey, Lord, didn't you do that? Didn't you swear that my son Solomon should become the king?" And she even takes it one step further. She said, "My Lord, you told me my son, Solomon should become, or your son Solomon should become king." She almost is like, "Hey, this is what you said. Here's what's happening."
Sign the will now.
Yeah.
Hurry up. Get Mom to sign the will now.
Exactly. So, but you know what?
People are just downright.
Yeah. And what is the image you get when you look at David, at like David's part here in these verses?
Yeah.
Oh, actually, we're not even there yet. But never mind. Sorry.
Oh.
Sorry, friends, got my notes
Well,
mixed up here. But
still, you've got that. It kind of confirms the picture that he's probably senile. That seems to imply that he's maybe senile.
Yeah.
Because he's elderly because he can't keep.
Yeah.
And then they're coming in and telling him things that didn't
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
And they're assuming he's going to believe it.
Yeah.
He's going to buy
Yeah.
it.
I mean, their plan is certainly cheap,
Yes.
right? It's like, let's just tell him a lie and see if he'll run
Right,
with it. I
and
mean,
we'll tell him it's,
yeah.
we'll
And you don't do that to a guy who could just say, "You're lying to me.
Yeah,
Kill
off with
her."
your head,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. You don't usually do that to someone who's still in their right mind, right? Exactly. All right. Are there any more questions? Any more comments? Anything you learned about in these verses? If not, let's keep reading on from verse, I think 28 through, let's go through 40.
You want me to?
Sure, go for it, Carol.
King David answered, "Summon Bathsheba to me." So she came into the king's presence and stood before the king. The king swore, saying, "As the Lord lives, who has saved my life from every adversity, as I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, your son Solomon shall succeed me as king, and he shall sit on my throne in my place. So will I do this day." Then Bathsheba bowed with her face to the ground and did obeisance to the king and said, "May my lord King David live forever." King David said, "Summon to me the priest Zadok, the prophet Nathan, and Benaiah, son of Jehoiada." When they came before the king said to them, "Take with you the servants of your lord, and have my son Solomon ride on my own mule, and bring him down to Gihon. There let the priest Zadok and the prophet Nathan anoint him king over Israel. Then blow the trumpet and say, 'Long live King Solomon.' You shall go up following him, Let him enter and sit on my throne, and he shall be king in my place, for I have appointed him to be ruler over Israel and over Judah. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, answered the king, Amen. May the Lord, the God of my Lord, the king, so ordain. As the Lord has been with my Lord the king, so may he be with Solomon, and make his throne greater than the throne of my king, of my Lord, King David. So the priest Zadok, the prophet Nathan, and Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, and Cherithis, and Pelethites,
Yes.
It just gets
went
worse.
down and had Solomon ride on King David's mule and led him to Gihon. There the priest Zadok took the horn of oil from the tent and anointed Solomon. Then they blew the trumpet, and all the people said, Long live King Solomon. And all the people went up following him, playing on pipes and rejoicing with great joy, so that the earth quaked at their noise.
All right. Any questions you might have?
I think this is why people are afraid of Bible study, having to read the names aloud.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll take care of it next time. I'm sorry. Yeah, there certainly was a good number of names in there, wasn't there?
Yes.
So it's confusing a little bit right at 28, right? We had Bathsheba come to David, right, and saying, hey, Adonijah crowned himself king, right? Right after that, we see Nathan come in and do the same. Why does King David have to summon Bathsheba here right now, right? I guess the reason for that is plain and simply, I'm not asking you this, okay? This is a little bit, it's probably that only one person at a time got an audience with the king. So, yeah, Abishag might have been able to stay during this time, but for the most part, it's like only one person at a time gets to disturb King David at his temple or at his palace. So Bathsheba was probably, who knows where, at least out of the room, out of the scenery. She hasn't heard about that, or at least wasn't allowed to be present while Nathan and David kind of, talked to one another. And so that's why she was probably summoned back in again. And, and then David kind of goes on and talks. What is the picture so we already talked about David in the previous verses, right? Like how it seems like he was a little senile, like they're trying to take advantage of him with a pretty cheap plan, really. How do you feel about David now that he's been talking for an extended amount of time?
Well, it seems like he knows what he's doing now.
Ah, okay.
Except
Yeah.
Bathsheba had to tell him.
Yeah.
But he knows specifically who he wants. He calls the names, bring me these people.
Okay.
To
Okay.
accomplish this.
Fair enough.
He knew
Fair enough.
what had
Yeah.
to happen.
And
Yeah.
you knew the order,
Right.
or
and-
the assumed order, you would assume, or
And
there
had-
was some sort of a plan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was very specific.
Okay.
What they were supposed to do.
He's trying to tap down a rebellion, I think.
Ah. What kind of rebellion?
Well, he's
Uh-huh.
losing control, so another king is being
Oh,
appointed, and
yeah.
he's still alive, and
That
Yeah.
wasn't the plan, yeah. Makes sense.
Good point.
it necessarily wasn't the king he had planned to succeed him.
Ah, okay.
So this is almost like a subtle coup,
Okay.
I think.
Did they have a regular succession? Because it says in here that he had said that Solomon would be his king after him.
Yeah, that's what they claim, right? So I guess the truth of the matter is back then it wasn't that necessarily, it wasn't yet established that the king's oldest son would become the next king. So that might have come later, or probably came later, but at King David's time it wasn't yet the case, So
But still, the king would have appointed who would follow him.
Exactly,
right? And
exactly.
So they just kind of had thrown him off as he's too old and he didn't do it, so. we're
At least
gonna
Adonijah
jump
did,
up
right?
on him.
And his people, they were just kind of like, they're really rash and impatient here, right? They're just kind of going for it. They're just like, okay, my dad's old, let's do
And of
this.
course, Solomon had the best schooling and this and that, and it's my son.
Well, did Solomon have the best schooling, right? I mean, we don't really hear, I think. At least we haven't seen it in this Bible study. I don't think that necessarily Solomon was the best qualified.
But it keeps order.
Well, especially if David says, right, Solomon shall be. Yeah.
Yeah, it will keep order, whereas if this other guy just comes up, then
Exactly.
he's gonna have some followers and some
Yep.
that lag back, and
Yep.
so you
Exactly.
have order again.
Yep.
Well, it's dividing the kingdom, especially the tactics that's being used.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's true.
Jerry
Yep.
Springer episode.
Yeah, exactly. That's probably the better word for it than soap opera. Thank you, Dave. Yeah. So it's David Springer and Jerry Springer in the making. I'm sorry. Yes, that's right. But Claire, you're absolutely right. You know, that getting the king's approval was certainly a necessary step if you wanted to become king. As one of the young princes here, I guess.
Because you
Don't
would
go
think
straight to
they
the.
would be being groomed. They would understand all the importance of the formalities of, well, you're king. This
That's
is the
true.
way you have to rule. This is the way you have to interact with your people. This is how you treat your servants. This. So you would assume, and then how bad of a shape is dad versus the son to then pass down the statute
Yeah.
of the name and hierarchy if it really wasn't established back then. But that's. Or did that start setting that precedence for the world to follow
Yeah.
thereafter as well, as you pointed out?
Well, I think it already kind of was a precedence, maybe not
Really
set
adhered
cast in
to,
stone,
right.
but
Yeah, or
either you were the first son or you were assassinated. You assassinated your way into power. Was the two typical
Well.
ways of gaining power.
Well, like I said, back then the oldest son didn't necessarily gain the throne yet. It might have been, and I mean, I'm sure David probably also made his mind up about it at some point. But either way, I think. I mean, he still knows people here, right? That's good. That's good, and he's able to like recall them. But it is interesting still, right? How after Bathsheba and Nathan have kind of pushed for Solomon to become king, how he's like, yes, get me Solomon, right? It stands to reason and stands to wonder. Did David make that decision, or did he let them push it on him? To an extent, right?
Because he's ruled for a long time. He's ruled for 40 years.
Yeah.
And so he's an older man. He has to kind of know this is coming. And if they don't have a succession that's, just assumed, why didn't he take care of this before now? Why the last, 10 years or so?
Yeah.
Wasn't he kind of setting this up?
Or
You
did
kind of
he
had to
get-
wonder
That's
how it
true.
got to this point that he's
Yeah.
kind of that bad off.
Well, I'm not going to get sick.
Does he? And I don't think he thinks he's going to live forever either.
No, I doubt that too. That's true.
I don't know that he would have thought that either.
But all
So I
the
kinda
old
wonder why he
prophecy,
didn't set that
all
up.
of their great-great-great-grandfathers lived to be hundreds of
yeah,
years old,
true.
so they're thinking, well,
maybe.
hey, maybe I got those genes. I mean,
How old were lifespans? during
Back
this
in those
time?
days, I think if you were around 60, you were already a blessed person.
Okay.
yeah, you didn't.
Life was a lot rougher back then, and I mean, as a king, especially if you were David and you kind of had your battles of your youth and you came through unscathed pretty much, or at least, with nothing lethal or miming or whatever. If you hung back for a little bit, and I mean, as a king, you probably got good treatment. It might have stand to expect that you were around, I'm just making this up, 60-ish, but certainly shorter than they are today. I think even back in the 1930s when Social Security first started, I think the life expectancy was actually 60 years. So, we're a lot more blessed really nowadays in the States or the Western industrialized world in general, where our life expectancy is in the high 70s now. Compared to even a few generations back, and especially back then.
Well, there's so many more ways to care for people now.
That's
They
true.
live longer.
That's true. Yeah. But the other interesting part here about these verses also is, right, we've seen Adonijah, right? He kind of has his little private party, right? He kind of sacrifices a little bit. So David gets right back at him, at his older son, right, and just kind of says, okay, if they're in En Rogel, we're going to go to the springs of Gihon, right, and we're going to bring out the tent, right? We're going to bring the horn. We're going to set Solomon onto a mule, and we're going to bring all the people of Israel there pretty much. So Gihon and Rogel were kind of like right next to each other. It might have been a distance of like a half a mile or something like that. It's almost like as if Adonijah would have said, oh, you know what, let's crown me king, and we're going to go down to the Walmart parking lot right there in Miller Lane. And David's like, oh, they're in the parking lot of Walmart right there in Miller Lane. We're going to go to Sam's Club, and we're going to set up the big old tent that we have the Ark of the Covenant under, right? Like, and we bring on everything along, right? Brown's house and everything,
And
right?
we'll anoint Solomon.
Exactly.
Everybody.
Exactly. And really, Solomon gets the whole package. He really does. Because back then, actually, people didn't ride horses yet, so they rode donkeys and mules, okay? Let's keep that in mind for Sunday. It's going to be Palm Sunday, right?
Well,
Jesus is
I
going
thought that when they said,
Yes.
significant anything?
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. That's the significance there. So this is royal, okay? I know mules are not necessarily nice animals. They're stubborn, right, is what they're known for. But royal animals back then. So that's why when you rode a mule, like this was, yay.
I
This
thought
was,
they did have horses back then.
they might
I
have,
thought
but they were not.
more for royalty and more for war.
Okay.
At least in Jesus' time.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think of the Egyptians, right, chariots and stuff, that worked out, but
To ride in a donkey was humbling himself. Here he is, Jesus, but he's humbling himself and he's appealing more to the more common or middle class or whatever.
okay, yeah, but either way, back in those days, back in King David's days,
And it's
mules were still,
Yeah.
they were
Well,
still
in
the royal.
Jesus' day, it was less threatening.
It could have been, and you know what, that could have been a part of the story too, but
Less threatening strategically, but
Yeah.
biblically, it was saying, he's the Messiah.
yeah,
And he's the one that has the authority,
that's it.
which really messed with the clergy of the day. Kind of like,
Yeah.
we're the big guys. We don't want this
Exactly.
new guy taking over.
Exactly, right? Yeah, so what Jesus did back then would have probably been the equivalent to us today walking around with a crown of thorns, right? And carrying a cross. Like, nobody does that anymore. I mean, people didn't like to do that back then already, right? But it has a certain religious connotation, right? I mean, yeah, you might as well just take an orange overall and kind of put your hands in shackles, right? And just kind of walk along. That would have been the 21st century equivalent, but yeah, absolutely. It certainly, so that's an interesting point too, right? So this has really, even Jesus riding in on Palm Sunday has a Solomon/David kind of taste to it, I would say, or at least old Israel style kind of taste to it. Yeah, exactly. And so, well, either way, right? Solomon kind of gets the whole package here. So, yeah. And the other part about it is too, there's something swinging around that still makes David look old and kind of weak. At some point, David was known for kind of knowing pretty much everything that went on. He was, he's considered very smart and obviously very strong, right? Here, now he has Abishag to take care of him. And I mean, this is not just his concubine or his little muse. It was probably also a mixture, like the word that they're using here, to keep him warm and things. She was kind of his assistant too. So she also probably did for him the everyday usual tasks that he could not do. Can you please get me a glass of water because I'm too weak, That also kind of swung around with it. And the other piece is, right, he has to be informed of what's going on with his son Adonijah here, that he just kind of went out and crowned himself king, that Joab isn't there anymore, and that so many others have kind of gone with him as well, so many others of his old guard as well. So that's part of it. Can I get someone to read verses 41 through the end of the chapter for me?
Adonijah and all the guests who were with him heard it as they finished feasting. When Joab heard the sound of the trumpet, he said, "Why is the city in an uproar?" While he was still speaking, Jonathan, son of the priest Abiathar, arrived. Adonijah said, "Come in, for you are a worthy man, and surely you bring good news." Jonathan answered Adonijah, "No, for our Lord King David has made Solomon king. The king has sent with him the priest Zadok, the prophet Nathan, and Benaiah, son of Jehoiada. And the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and they had him ride on the king's mule. The priest Zadok and the prophet Nathan have anointed him king at Gihon, and they have gone up from there rejoicing, so that the city is in an uproar. This is the noise that you heard. Solomon now sits on the royal throne. Moreover, the king's servants came to congratulate our Lord King David, saying, May God make the name of Solomon more famous than yours, and make his throne greater than your throne. The king bowed in worship on the bed and went on to pray thus, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who today has granted one of my offspring to sit on my throne and permitted me to witness it. Then all the guests of Adonijah got up trembling and went their own ways. Adonijah, fearing Solomon, got up and went to grasp the horns of the altar. Solomon was informed. Adonijah is afraid of King Solomon. See, he has laid hold of the horns of the altar, saying, Let King Solomon swear to me first that he will not kill his servant with the sword. So Solomon responded, If he proves to be a worthy man, not one of his heirs shall fall to the ground. But if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. Then King Solomon sent to have him brought down from the altar. He came to do obeisance to King Solomon, and Solomon said to him, Go home.
Thank you so much. Yes. So, wow, what a scene, right? So Adonijah is still in party mood. I mean, he must have heard it, right? And he thought, hey, this was all for him, right? This is my noise. Things are going well here. And I guess his mouth must have opened wider and wider in fear as he kind of heard what the messenger brought, right? So really it's kind of that King David has made Solomon king, and that everyone kind of followed, and that everyone kind of, worshipped, really, or kind of, has worshipped the Lord and has kind of proclaimed Solomon king. And what's the next thing that happens? Everyone runs away, right? Everyone kind of runs their way, like, never mind, we're going home here. The other interesting thing about it is, I think, is what Adonijah does, right? He goes to grab the horns of the altar. It's kind of strange, right? We don't have those anymore. We don't have horns on our altar anymore. What that means is usually those horns were kind of, those were considered to be holy. So if you touched those, you could not just be killed. You were kind of like, it's almost like seeking God's refuge. So as long as I touch the horn, you just, you cannot, and people would not kill you as much as they hated you, It was just, this is the Lord's presence, and he's kind of, it's almost like the Lord sheltered you. Technically, yes, but you couldn't kind of, you couldn't always stay there forever, right? Like at some point something had to happen. And so what Adonijah does, because he's kind of in a difficult spot here, right, is just saying, Solomon, if you swear to me, what he really needs now is an oath of Solomon, is like his holy promise, basically. Like, look, if I break this promise, right, God's going to be mad at me. I mean, God's going to come after me kind of promise. That if, not to kind of be harmed, right? But he doesn't get it. Solomon ultimately doesn't give him that. He just kind of says, look, if you're a good person, I'm not going to harm you. But he says that, but he never really kind of swears it, right? Like there's no big and holy promise here. He doesn't say, well, by, in the name of the Lord, I will not touch you. That doesn't happen. He just kind of says, hey, if you're doing good, if you're being a nice guy, we're going to be fine. We're not going to have a problem. Like, I can tell you that, but there's no big old guarantee, so to speak.
Well, how did they come about, like, just kind of making a king on the throne?
You mean with Adonijah?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the big question, right? Mm-hmm. I'm guessing Adonijah felt so secure and so safe that he could just do that he went ahead and did it.
But it isn't like he checked in with Solomon or any other
nope.
David or anything else.
Nope. And it might have just been pretty much a revolt, right? A rebellion in the making there, yeah, that we just kind of witnessed. And at the same time, I mean, we do also kind of get to ask ourselves, what would have happened if Adonijah would have never done that? Then Nathan wouldn't have had a reason to come in to Bathsheba and say, hey, he's making Adonijah king. We gotta interfere right now, right? What would have happened if Nathan and Bathsheba would have never walked into David and said, hey, you promised, Solomon to be king, right? Would it just have been that David would have been like, well, my oldest is Adonijah, he's good enough, on the throne with him, right?
But and then what verse?
It also might have been too late to undo what has been done.
Yeah, at that point, right, like here in the later verses of this chapter, you're busted, right? You recognize that, yeah, that's true.
In verse 48, though, David says, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who today has granted one of my offspring to sit on my throne and permitted me to witness it. Again, I'm back to, if you're thanking God for this, why didn't you set this up 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Because now you're saying, thank you, God, for showing me the light and showing me and allowing me to see this. Well, you could have set it up all along. Thinking, this is just, God.
That is true.
That is true. But it just seems kind of odd that it's David's response, of course, to be thankful, and I get that. But you're kind of last minute here.
Yeah, that is true.
Maybe he didn't think he had to give it up yet. He still thought he
didn't want to, or whatever.
Yeah.
Or that was kind of keeping him going or something.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe also just designating someone as your successor, let's say 3 years ahead of time, right? As we sometimes get taught today, right? Like there's a way to retiring, right? There's strategy involved in this.
Right.
Like you just don't hand over the baton. Like you train someone to, maybe that would not have worked back then, because from the moment on you're saying you're going to be king if I die, you have a good reason to kill me or have me killed, by a femme fatale, right?
Here's a glass of wine. Guess
Exactly.
Guess first.
Exactly, right?
Yeah,
There's
you don't want the
servant,
plan
take
out
a-
there.
Maybe you don't want that. Yep.
But you think he could have done it? You didn't have to tell anybody.
That's
Just
true.
Still set it up, and it seems
Yep.
all new to him.
That is true.
But maybe he's waiting for God's sign.
He might. Yeah, and that's the other piece, right? Is where's God in this story, really? It's not like, right, we have Nathan kind of come in and say, hey, Solomon should be king, and he kind of takes matters into his own hands, but it's not like God ever speaks, right? Or at least not that we know. There's never a Nathan said, thus says the Lord. That doesn't happen, right? We don't hear God speaking to Nathan at night. We don't even hear anyone having some kind of an inkling about what God is doing, right? The only time we hear it is in verses like this with David, right? Where David says, well, blessed be the Lord for this. I'm glad I get to still see this. That's pretty much the only time we see it, and I think we see it in back in verse 36, we can kind of see it as well. Amen, may the Lord, the God of my Lord the King, so ordain, right? May he so ordain God. But for some reason, God is kind of very much in the background here, which is technically untypical of the younger David we had seen, if we think about it, right? This is not the kind of David who prays first and then goes to battle. But at the same time, I guess, it's almost like it's underlying, if we kind of think about it, maybe it's underlying that God's will is being done, even through Jerry Springer. Now that's a word.
Yeah.
So, even through all these intrigues and all these soap operas here, somehow I guess God's will, at least God is still praised for God's will being done, right? But once again, this is a time, especially, right, and these people lived with the mindset that God was always in control, and what happened was somehow God's will as well, in one way or another. So yeah, are there any more questions we have about this kind of about these verses here? Well, if not, we can just continue on, basically. Now let's just read the... I tell you what, I think you've all read one. No, you haven't, Doug, right?
I haven't.
Would you like to? You can say no if you don't want to.
I think I'll skip.
All right. Well, I'll read chapter 2.
those words,
Yeah.
do you?
I'll read chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. That's how far I want to take it today. David's instruction to Solomon. When David's time to die drew near, he charged his son Solomon, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong, be courageous, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. Then the Lord will establish his word that he spoke concerning me. If your heirs take heed to their way, walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, there shall not fail you a successor on the throne of Israel. Moreover, you know also what Joab, son of Zeruiah, did to me, how he dealt with the two commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Jether, whom he murdered, retaliating in time of peace for blood that had been shed in war, and putting the blood of war on the belt around his waist and on the sandals on his feet. Act therefore according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace. Deal loyally, however, with the sons of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and let them be among those who eat at your table. For with such loyalty they met me when I fled from your brother Absalom. There is also with you Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjaminite from Bahurim, who cursed me with a terrible curse on the day when I went to Mahanaim. But when he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, I will not put you to death with the sword. Therefore do not hold him guiltless, for you are a wise man. You will know what you ought to do to him, and you must bring his gray head down with blood to Sheol. Then David slept with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. The time that David reigned over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his kingdom was firmly established. All right. Those are the 12 verses. Have you ever heard of Sheol before?
I think so, but
Okay.
I don't remember. I think so.
That usually is actually like an old word for hell, pretty much. That's kind of where you kind of, I guess, went, or usually kind of the place where, I guess, where all dead souls went, really, because I don't think they had a concept necessarily of heaven or hell yet. You know, God's blessing was with you if you were a good person, if you lived a God-fearing life, your life was going to be better here on earth. You know, it wasn't necessarily about God's going to send you to heaven necessarily. That comes with Jesus. But either way, right, if we look at it, do not hold him guiltless, for you are a wise man. You will know what you ought to do with him, and you must bring his gray head down with blood to Sheol, are the last words of big old King David that we hear. Not exactly the stuff that we would have expected, right? Pretty revengeful. Good old David.
Well, especially for kind of his last words.
Yeah, exactly. At least those are the last words we hear of, right?
Right.
Let's hope we died with something nicer on his
Yeah.
lips that would have been a good.
Started out pretty good.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
All his revenge.
Yeah.
Just take out these two clowns for me.
Yeah, isn't that funny? And especially if we think about who he's trying to take out, right? He's going after Joab. That was a commander of his army all these years, right? Like Joab fought all the hard fights for him, right? How convenient! Like he used him, and now Solomon, you get rid of him for me, right? But at the same time, I mean, and we've seen one of those cases, or at least I think I told you about one of those cases, right? Abner was the Israel, right? He was Saul's general at some point, and Abner was the guy who killed Joab's brother, right, with the butt end of his spear, at some point, right? So then Abner later on came over to Judah and said, "Hey, David, I'll serve you." And David said, "Cool," right? And Joab said. And Joab just kind of killed him in his sleep, I think, at some point, right? He just kind of went against him, was like, he was a spy. So, you know, that's how Joab kind of dealt with that on his own, right? Not on King David's watch, but on Joab's watch, more so. And Amasa, I think, was a similar thing. Amasa was kind of the guy, you know, when Absalom had his rebellion against David, Joab kind of fought, I think, on Absalom's side. And Amasa was the guy who kind of stepped up. He was the new Joab, so to speak. And after the whole thing was over, right, Amasa and Joab, you know, were kind of like reintegrated into David's army, and David said, "Hey, no, I think Amasa was with Absalom, I'm sorry. I think I'm confusing the two. Either way, they were kind of like, both in the same spot there, and they were both reintegrated into David's army afterwards. And so what happened then was, I think there was a next revolt coming up, and Amasa didn't do anything, or he kind of hesitated a little bit too long for Joab's taste. And so Joab killed Amasa as well. So he was apparently sometimes a hothead by himself, right, and just kind of worked over his Lord David's favor, so to speak. But once again, what we can see here is, right, David seemed to have never had the heart to kill Joab, right, or to punish Joab even. We don't really hear anything about that. We just kind of let him go on his way, right? Even though he was a strong ally, and even though David was the king and could have just totally done that, he never did. So David, there's once again, we see a different side of David's weakness here that must have, been there even before he became old and senile, perhaps. But Solomon kind of steps up, and he's the strong guy to take care of things, so to speak. So.
I'm going to argue with you on in the Old Testament doesn't have the concept of heaven. I think there are little seeds planted in it. And we've discussed this before a few weeks ago. A place where there's no war. They talked about it before. To me, that sounds a little bit like heaven.
Yeah.
And maybe there was actually a war in heaven, but it's probably a lot more peaceful than it is here. A lot less sin,
Well, heaven certainly is, yeah, that's true. And I mean, you know what? When we talk about Old Testament too, you're right. It might have been an overgeneralization. We're talking about a time. I mean, this book, came to be within. I mean, it took not millennia, but centuries, right? It took about 1,000 years to write the thing. Yeah. Within that meantime, people back in David's day, that people didn't really think about necessarily heaven or hell yet. Yeah. Even when you look at the book of Proverbs, right? The whole theology is very much earth-centered, so to speak, or at least the basic theology is, where it's kind of like, if you do good, you will get good. If you do bad, you will get bad. That's the crazy part about Kohelet. If you go to Kohelet, kind of like Kohelet is like, this is not true. This is a legitimate theological crisis, because Kohelet kind of realizes, no, bad things still happen to good people. It does not matter.
But what about the prophet that didn't seem to die? He just rode a chariot into heaven?
He might have been the exception, yeah. But how many people did that happen, right? Yeah.
I think that was just planting the ideas, a little seed here and there, and then Jesus brought it to fruition.
That makes sense, yeah. I mean, and you're right, that obviously always existed, right? Elijah, he comes down the line, he comes a few chapters later here, at the end, towards the end of 1 Kings. So that's true, yeah, and he will ultimately go right up in the fiery chariot up to heaven. That's true. He will not die, and the same was true for Enoch in one of the very first chapters of the Bible. There's a couple of people who just did not die, yeah. But there's at least the idea of, I guess, of going to heaven after you die. Is at least still foreign, so to speak.
Well, they say here, in this one, David is going to, when he sleeps with his ancestors.
Yeah.
He's just going to sleep sleep with his ancestors here. It doesn't say when he goes to heaven, when he goes to be with the Lord, when he goes.
That's another thing, yeah.
Refer to it. It just says when he sleeps with his ancestors.
That's true.
Well,
he's done.
The Sheol is maybe where the bones are placed, like you're talking the crypts underground, and to them it's kind of like hell in a way, maybe a little.
I think later on it became kind of that idea of hell. So it's.
But the body may be here on earth, but if hopefully the spirit has gone to heaven.
Yeah, it doesn't say that, right? He just kind of he even says, right, I'm gonna go the way of all earth. So either way, in David's time, people don't really believed in it, didn't necessarily believe actually in heaven or hell yet, which came about with Jesus for sure.
Yeah, and then the paintings help too.
Yeah. Yep. No, that is true. Yeah, but another point that is already interesting, right, is in these very verses, David doesn't just point out that Solomon is in some way stronger than him, right? He also points out Solomon's wisdom to an extent, right? Where he says it, I think it was in, especially in verse 6, right? Act therefore according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace, right? So interestingly enough, when we think of wisdom, right, we would probably think of like old people who are really smart, right, and have everything figured out and find the greatest solution that we wouldn't even have seen, right? Almost like out-of-the-box thinkers that just kind of come up with conclusions and ways to get things done. Back in David's day, or back in in ancient Hebrew, when you talked about wisdom, it could have been all kinds of things. Craftiness, like being handyman, for example, like having that kind of knowledge, that special knowledge of like how to be a great carpenter. That was a form of wisdom, for example. So there were very much different kinds of wisdom, actually. Not just necessarily wisdom in terms of being wise, but also being politically smart sometimes. Being a good diplomat could have been one. I think in some parts, it was even mentioned that sometimes even things that we would see negatively, like duplicity, could have even been considered wisdom. So technical skills were also a sort of a form of wisdom. And interestingly enough, right, in connection to Solomon's wisdom, he's kind of being charged with, avenging the old man, right, to some extent, which is a little bit surprising. Yeah. And the only one I guess he's really supposed to, he's only supposed to show mercy to is Barzillai. Now, that's a weird name, right? And we haven't really heard that one yet, but apparently it was a person who kind of blessed David and was kind of taken him under his wings, or who's protected David when he was still fleeing Saul, back in earlier chapters. The important part I think about Barzillai is also, Barzil was the Hebrew word for iron. So Barzillai had something to do with the metal iron. And where he's from, like Gilead, we actually, even archaeologists found out that place was very important for like creating iron, like for iron ore. They had that kind of stuff. So they were, those were state-of-the-art iron forges there, I guess. And that was important back then. If you remember the fight against Goliath, right? Goliath versus David versus Goliath. Goliath was the guy, he had like iron shin straps, right? He had iron everything, like armor with iron. And iron was just, whatever makes stealth fighters stealthy, that was iron back in the day, right? It was state-of-the-art military equipment. It was better than your copper. It was better, honestly, than what David and his folks had, or what Saul and his folks had. It was just, you were just more equipped. So Barzillai was probably not only a good friend, he was probably also a good ally to have to give you access to, equip your army with a little bit of better material, so to speak. That was a kind of a good side story to that, yeah. So David knew how to make sure that his army, I guess, was at least equipped, so to speak.
And they may not have a whole lot of idea of resurrection, but they did kind of had a idea of heaven in the Old Testament, getting up on the mountain to be closer to God. Yeah.
That was always a place, right? And I mean, even in Isaiah, we see ideas, right, of like how the Lord will create a rich feast for Zion, right? And how all the people would come together. So there was that hope that God would kind of create in the end times a certain harmony among all the nations, right?
And part of having altar is the smoke is raising your prayers up to heaven or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was kind of traditional.
Yeah. That's right. That's working within you still, right? The idea. It's something to wrap your mind around, isn't it? And I mean even before that, right? Like sometimes we even hear like even Paul kind of refers to something like where he was kind of moved to the seventh heaven or something like that. I think he says that in 2 Corinthians at some point. He was not the first guy to say that, right? So there was that idea that human beings could kind of ascend at least up to heaven. If they stayed there forever, might have been a different discussion. But they could at least move there. And that belief, I think, also became more popular as we get closer to Jesus. Yes. So the later prophets might have been a different story. David, not so far yet necessarily, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. But certainly an intriguing story, isn't it? Quite the soap opera once again here. Man, every time we're at the King's Palace, it's kind of it's a drama, right? It's
When you got that many wives, it's going to be so.
I guess so. But clearly they don't even need the wives right now, right? Bathsheba was the only one who kind of got poked into it.
Well, you got all these guys vying for power, women vying for
Yep.
power, and sons
Yep.
and daughters
Yep.
vying for power. It's
Child
a soap
security.
opera.
And interestingly enough, right, the only guy who doesn't say a word in the story, right, is the one who's being made king. Solomon, really, today Solomon was the piece of furniture, right? It was just kind of like, we'll take Solomon. Solomon didn't even get to say yes. Who knows if he wanted to or not, right?
Give it
But
to
it's-
Mikey.
yeah.
He likes it. He likes it.
And it's sometimes, this is certainly not, if you want to teach your kids about how to behave correctly, this is not the chapter in the Bible for you. It's just, it's even hard to figure out who the good guys are, right? I mean, because you have Adonijah, who's clearly like the rash, right? He is the oldest son, yes, he's got that going for him, but he's too rash, right? He just kind of jumps right in, he's impulsive, he just kind of starts his show, and he obviously alienates everything that came after Hebron, right? After an early time of King David, right? So the past 33 years do not exist for Adonijah, so to speak, right? When David was in Jerusalem, it just doesn't play a role. And then on the other hand, you do have, right, Solomon and Nathan and his camp, who are also, they're devising a cheap plan to get David to say, yes, Solomon shall be king, right? At least so we think.
But it doesn't say who's the mother of any of these other ones, does it?
No, I don't. I might have missed that when we read it. It might say that, and you know what? If it doesn't say it here, it says it probably in an earlier chapter.
Because Bathsheba's the only wife you ever hear about.
Yeah, and she's the one who plays an active role today, right?
Yeah.
The others just aren't even mentioned. We don't even know. You kind of would expect, right, that Adonijah's mom kind of jumps in and goes like, "Yay, go Adonijah," right?
Well,
Or
we don't
that
really know
Yeah.
if she's still alive. Even.
That's the other
It says
point.
Adonijah-
Yeah, you're right.
Adonijah's son of Haggith, but we don't know
Yeah,
if she's
it's
still
Okay.
alive.
still
She's
there.
Yeah. So where is she, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Well, they never tell who the mothers are anyway. They're always just the son of somebody,
yeah.
a guy.
Yeah,
She's at
women
the
don't
well.
have much of a voice in the Bible, especially the
No.
Old Testament.
No,
She's
but
at the
clearly they could have had today, right, with this weak old king, because one of his wives clearly had a word here today. Yeah, so where are they, right? But either way, right, both sides are getting dirty here. Both sides are playing sort of dirty, or with all kinds of weapons that they had at their disposal, more or less. Yeah, this is not the chapter to teach people how to behave, for sure. So
Well, if you want to be king, maybe it is.
I guess so, yeah.
Maybe you can take a lesson. I don't know.
It may be, who knows, right?
It ain't easy being a Christian.
Yeah,
But Adonijah had a bad day. I mean, that just turned around in a matter of minutes for him.
It looks like it,
He was way
right?
up here, the king, and then he's fearing for his life.
Yep.
And all his friends have scattered.
Yep.
And nobody wants anything to do with him anymore. And before they're rallying around because he's
Right.
going to be the king. So he's
right,
gonna
yeah.
do
All of a
it.
sudden, they just want to save their own behinds, right? I mean, that's really
We're
what's
all
happening.
down partying in the room below
Yikes.
for Easter, but then someone's out in our parking lot trying to have a party, right? And we're like, whoa, wait a minute, we better
Well.
go outside, right?
Well,
Yeah.
very true.
Because Solomon could have said, and as my first act as king, I'm taking you out. So you don't do this again. Don't get any ideas again. He could have
That's
taken
true.
them out.
That is
So,
very true. Yep.
That's a bad day.
So I lost track. Are we supposed to go to Walmart's parking lot?
Sam's Club or
That's going to give me a lot of other trouble
Yeah,
in other
exactly.
Bible studies and other churches.
Go to the Springs of Gihon, wherever that is.
or find Skyline Chili to get out of
There you
trouble.
go.
There we go. Yeah. Well, just a spoiler alert. If you want to keep reading that second chapter, not that we're going to talk about it, but yeah, it will be interestingly enough, because I think Adonijah actually does die in the next in 1 Kings 2. So he doesn't make it even to the next chapter anymore, but he continues to be rude. Actually, I just couldn't wait. I'm sorry, I couldn't wait to tell you. So this is fascinating though, because I think he then asked Solomon to marry Abishag.
Yeah, I read ahead too.
Yeah.
Because I
Yes,
remember
yes.
doing chapters 1 and
Exactly,
4 just
exactly,
once, so I
yep.
went and skimmed kind of chapter
Yes,
2.
yes.
It's
So
really
he asked
interesting.
for Abishag to be his wife, right? And
Yes.
Solomon was like, "Oh, kill him." Who knows what a companion
Maybe,
was, right?
yes,
So
yeah.
her role kind of remains foggy here. I mean, it's. I mean, sure, there was an erotic touch to it, right? So she was
Right.
certainly something like a concubine. I mean, I guess that makes you a concubine.
Yeah, I think it's,
Yeah,
still
but
did, really.
and at the same
Yeah.
time, she's probably also kind of the caregiver here. So
Yes.
yeah.
Interesting.
Plus, she was very beautiful. Solomon probably wanted her for himself.
So why not?
Yep, exactly. Well, friends, thank you for joining us here at this Bible study, More Than a Shepherd. This was a longer one. and I feel like we learned about half of David's life, or read half the story, and really not the rest. There are actually some more nuggets in there. Maybe we'll get to do that later at some point. I'm not sure. So we'll probably resume with Bible studies in a few weeks. We'll see. Yeah. I don't know if there's anything. Yeah, take a break for right now. So, you might too. All these Tuesday nights. So yeah, if there's anything that you want to know, anything that you want to learn about, let me know. We can get this together. Good deal.